Well, FCC Commissioner Brendan Carr went on CNBC to defend his decision to issue a not-so-thinly veiled threat to Jimmy Kimmel and ABC, the owners, Disney, the owners of ABC, ahead of the company's decision to indefinitely suspend Kimmel. It's looking from some reports like that may just be a couple day-long suspension rather than a full cancellation, as Donald Trump posted in a Truth Social shortly after the news broke. Let's go ahead and roll FCC Commissioner Brendan Carr. Before we do, Undercurrents.tv, that's where you can join the Undercurrents community for the full premium experience of the show, full versions of our interviews, and of course, subscribe on YouTube. We're so close to 100,000 subscribers, and wherever you get your podcasts. Now here's Brendan Carr.
Broadcast TV is different. We're on a cable show right now. You don't have an FCC license. You don't have an obligation to serve the public interest. Podcasts don't either. Stand-up comedians, whether they're on lots of forms of communications, don't. And Kimmel is free to do that. But if you have a broadcast TV license, that means that you have something that very few people have. And you're excluding other people from having access to that valuable public resource. And it comes with an obligation to serve the public interest. And again, over the years, there's been a rule in place at the FCC that local TV stations get to preempt programming that they don't think meets the needs of their communities. But recently, these national programmers, ABC, Disney, Comcast, NBC, they've been exercising outsized control and power over those local TV stations, and there's been no pushback. And this is a very significant moment because local broadcasters are now pushing back on national programmers for the first time that I can think of in modern history. And that's one of the things we want at the FCC. We want to empower local broadcasters that have the public interest obligation to push back on national programmers so that people have more choice.
So when Brendan Carr says, quote, "This is a very significant moment because local broadcasters are now pushing back on national programmers for the first time that I can think of in modern history," that is very interesting to me because I checked in with a source who has knowledge of everything that went down shortly after it all went down on Wednesday night. And they framed it in really similar terms. I'm just pulling it up right now. Basically, local broadcasters standing up to big Hollywood is what this person described it as. And just to go through the TikTok here a little bit, what happened is that Jimmy Kimmel on Monday night made a joke about MAGA trying to pretend the shooter who assassinated Charlie Kirk was, quote, anyone but one of them. I'm paraphrasing him, but that was basically the joke. The guy who shot Charlie Kirk, MAGA was trying to say was anything but one of them. Well, by Monday, Utah Governor Spencer Cox, speaking with knowledge of the investigation, had said that the shooter came from a leftist ideology, that law enforcement was aware of ideologically where he was. So for Jimmy Kimmel to toss that barb out on Monday, I think is obviously tasteless at best. It's not funny. I mean, it wasn't like much of a edgy punchline. I'll always support humor when it's actually, incisive. But it was based on an incorrect fact. And Brendan Carr is saying something that is correct. I actually asked Brendan Carr about this a couple of months ago because I think it's interesting. Right now, networks like ABC license the airwaves from the government. That's how this was all set up. It is actually a public resource. The airwaves are actually a public resource. So you are obligated, if you're one of those broadcast networks, ABC, CBS, NBC, to operate in the public interest. What hasn't happened before, at least on the scale, is FCC commissioners coming out and saying, we could do this the easy way or the hard way, which is what Brendan Carr said on Benny Johnson's show Wednesday. After Brendan Carr said that, this story is such a tangled knot. Nexstar, big media conglomerate Nexstar, actually said that they were going to yank Kimmel off the airwaves at their local ABC affiliates and air counter programming, basically. So that put extra pressure on ABC to issue this, quote, indefinite suspension of Jimmy Kimmel, which Donald Trump then said was a cancellation. It looks like it's not actually going to be a cancellation. It looks like it's going to be a couple day long suspension. We'll see how that turns out. But to add to all of this, Nexstar is also currently trying to merge with another media conglomerate called Tegna, which is a spinoff of Gannett, when Gannett spun off some of its local TV affiliates years ago. Nexstar is trying to merge with that company, which I am against. I haven't looked into the details of it. Maybe I will in the future. But basically, from what I've seen as I have looked into it just over the last, week or so, is not good. I'm not in any way supportive of media consolidation, especially with these local affiliates. That's something that has always concerned me. So it looks like a bad merger. And I guarantee you, let's just put it this way. It's very likely Nexstar thought the merger would be helped by their decision to put out a press release saying Kimmel was being dropped from the airwaves. I am sure that had something to do with it. But, and this is what we're going to talk about here, the attempt to apples this situation between, 2020 era cancel culture, I find deeply, deeply frustrating. And let me just give me a little space here, because I want to work through this. The cancel culture question was always a super nuanced one. And I actually think this case is too, because there's actual market pressure on ABC not to have Jimmy Kimmel hurting the network like this. People don't want to hear just sort of like C-grade jokes about the shooting of someone in the aftermath of it, of someone as prominent as Charlie Kirk, in such a violent event that was so upsetting to so many people. Remember how Dean Withers reacted as a sort of left-wing influencer after he saw what happened to Kirk, or how Ezra Klein has reacted, how actually Hassan Piker immediately reacted, which was, this is terrifying. And that was like a really genuinely, generationally painful moment for just about everybody who had to watch that video. So for Jimmy Kimmel to make maybe a D+ level joke based on a falsehood, it's actually not good for ABC. They do genuinely have the public interest obligation that the government has basically never wielded, even under Republicans in modern history, as these media networks were clearly biased against them. And I've said this since the news broke, but like, if a Democratic FCC commissioner wanted to pressure NBC News for spreading falsehoods in the lead up to another like war in Iraq, for example, and say you were not operating in the public interest, we could do this the easy way or the hard way, I would be 100% for that. I would not be for yanking anybody's broadcast licenses, but if you are licensing, if you are renting a public resource, a public good, like a national park, by the way, and you're doing that at the benefit of a democratic government or constitutional Republican system, yes, the people who are appointed to these positions can, exercise their obligation to remind you to act in the public interest. I don't like the idea of yanking people off the airwaves for speech, but I actually think the law probably needs to be changed. And I talked to Brendan Carr about that again a couple of months ago. To me, this is a law that is wildly outdated. The entire system of licensing the airwaves is outdated, and it probably all needs to be rethought. That's a tangent that's sort of beside the point in this case. But what I'm trying to get at here is that ABC, you could say that Nexstar wanted a merger through and that pressured ABC. I think that's probably true. You can say that Brendan Carr wants networks to be less critical of the right, and is therefore pressuring ABC to suspend a left of center comedian. Probably true. Did all of that mean ABC suspended Kimmel only for those reasons? No. And I think to dismiss the market pressures at hand here, as these massive media corporations are waking up to the reality that they alienated potential members of their audience for a really long time and coasted on this sloppy and lazy content while they were chasing these niches, which we've talked about here before. Stephen Colbert is a really, really good example of this, and continued to pay them so much money, way more money. Colbert not turning a profit. He's paid so much money. He has so many members of his staff. I think that show has like over 100 members of the staff, roughly like that. I have to go back and check for sure. But these are shows with massive overhead that are no longer turning a profit because you can't spend that much money on a show with that little of an audience. And they weren't used to having smaller audiences. It's something that happened really quickly as technology democratized. And so these corporations right now are waking up to the fact that they need to make adjustments. And never is that more obvious than when you have lazy, sloppy content that pisses off potential viewers and potentially chases away who? Well, advertisers. So there's a serious market question that I promise you was being debated at the Disney C-suite. And that brings me to another point, which is, okay, throughout the great cancel culture wars of the 2010s, all of the time, you would hear people on the left somewhat amusingly sounding like libertarians and saying, well, this is a private company. Let's talk about the Roseanne firing. Roseanne actually tweeted something extremely bizarre about Valerie Jarrett that led to her losing her show on ABC, even while it was enormously popular, because ABC was actually trying to chase a broad audience again with that show. This is all so like poetic and ironic in certain ways. But again, she's an artist. I subscribe to the Camille Paglia line that the idea of an artist as a moral actor is a, quote, sentimental canard of Victorian moralism. That was a good line from Camille right in the middle of the Me Too reckoning. But Roseanne gets fired. Gina Carano, you may remember, got fired over a meme that I think at worst could be described as insensitive, but was charitably fairly anodyne, you could even call it like anti-fascist, or in the most literal sense of that. But listen, these moments, when we look back, think about New York Times versus Tom Cotton. A lot of what the right and the kind of heterodox left was complaining about during peak cancel culture is actually not this idea that people were getting, quote, canceled for doing something wrong, right? Like there were a lot of conversations about how we need to have more mercy and grace and more forgiveness in our culture, and that we've lost that in the era, particularly of social media and polarization. But actually, the argument in many cases is there's no reason to fire people like James Bennett or like Adam Rubenstein over publishing the Tom Cotton op-ed that was headlined by the New York Times, Send in the Troops, June of 2020, arguing for the Insurrection Act to be used in the midst of the riots that were killing people and destroying millions of dollars worth of property in America's major cities. That was a mainstream position of the Republican Party, of a wide swath of the public. There was never any reason, A, to retract the story, or B, to fire James Bennett and Adam Rubenstein over that op-ed. So many of these cases were not like the Roseanne case, where I just made the sort of Paglia civil libertarian argument about defending someone, giving someone grace because they're an artist, right? Showing a Louis C.K. movie, which, by the way, I did see I Love You, Daddy, and I've talked about this before. That was the movie that was yanked in the sort of height of Me Too, and it was a good movie. It was a very interesting movie. It was a very weird movie. It was a good movie. And so sometimes people were making those arguments, but often what it was is that these companies are responding to market pressures that don't actually exist because your, professional managerial class, millennial middle management was telling you that the country had gone further left than you thought it had, or because you were too afraid of those employees to say no. We've heard this is the case over and over again from people inside those organizations during this decade-long campaign of coordinated, intentional suppression and censorship that was entirely pushed by the left. Again, throughout, decade is a rough, that roughly captures what happened, but people should Google, because a lot of these stories didn't get much play. People should Google the Equality Act, which virtually every single Democrat has supported over like the last 10 years. Kamala Harris supported the Equality Act. Was there any outrage in the major media or from the left that is now upset about right-wing cancel culture when it came to the speech curtailments the Equality Act would have implemented? Absolutely not. We barely heard a peep about what the Equality Act would do to speech in schools. We barely heard a peep about what the Obama administration did to speech when it read gender identity into Title IX. Barely a word about that for years in the media, and it was affecting speech. It was chilling speech on college campuses. DEI was chilling speech in so many corporations that I can barely even capture the breadth of it right here. Google the Global Engagement Center, which, by the way, funded putting Unheard on a blacklist via the Global Disinformation Index. And this was all part of a State Department effort to suppress the reach of not even just conservative outlets, but places like Unheard that were willing to publish arguments that challenged the establishment and challenged the establishment consensus. That was from the State Department, and again, was barely discussed in the media. Google what happened, actually look up, I should say, what happened to avoid sounding repetitive. Look up what happened between Google and the Federalist, where I worked at the time when all of this went down. Look up lists of these cancellations and see how many of them were actually about someone doing something wrong versus someone transgressing the very narrow boundaries of acceptable speech that were set by the left. And oftentimes what you will find is that government policies or policies from major corporations that were in some sense inspired by government policies or decisions like Bostock from the Supreme Court were the impetus behind it. And so right-wing cancel culture, of course, there are going to be hypocrites. And I think it's absolutely important right now to say that what happened to Ramesa Ozturk, where she was apprehended by government thugs in masks with their faces covered, wearing all black off the street in broad daylight because she signed she co-authored an op-ed about BDS, supporting BDS, boycott, divestment, sanctions, at Tufts. That is completely insane, and it is hypocritical for an administration that purports to support free speech. What Clay Higgins said in the aftermath of Charlie Kirk's horrific assassination, what Pam Bondi said about free speech versus hate speech, which, by the way, was criticized by so many people on the right that she walked it back, but it was still insane. The online sleuths trying to find people who said something merely critical about Charlie Kirk that wasn't a literal celebration of political violence and assassination, and then trying to get those people reported to authorities. That is bad, 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 bad. The administration's policy towards Columbia University on speech codes, bad. All of that is absolutely true. I get it. I hear it. I agree with it. I'm going to say it when it comes up. But this reminds me so much of immigration, where the Biden administration floods the country in 3 years with, as David Leonhardt puts the number, around 8 million new people who are then in legally precarious situations as they wind their way through immigration court. And Republicans then react with policies that are sometimes very necessary and policies that are sometimes very bad. And the media will disproportionately focus on the bad reactions from the right as opposed to the bad policy from the left. And it's so frustrating. I get it. Whataboutism is enormously frustrating. But what's really frustrating is when the sort of source of whataboutism, if you go to the well where whataboutism and the spiral, if we chase it to the first domino, it's coming from what makes the right react sometimes in very bad ways. You can argue, I would disagree with it, of course, because I'm an ideological conservative, but you could argue that maybe there's something inherently about the right that, induces bad reactions, and we could talk about that. But I'm telling you, what induces many of these hypocritical reactions on speech, or overreactions, I should say, on speech, is sheer frustration with the people who tell you they are the responsible purveyors of what is a fact. I heard NPR talking about this literally on my way in, about shared facts from NPR. When those responsible purveyors who continue to get awards and shower themselves in praise and backpats continue to have a narrow aperture and refuse to broaden their aperture to talk about, for example, things like the Equality Act, to talk about the GEC, to talk about what the Obama administration did with Title IX. NBC was actually complicit in the case of Google and the Federalist. You basically had a snitch at another media organization going to a big tech company and complaining about a conservative media organization that was critical of political elites. And there was barely any concern about that. And this isn't even bringing up the Biden administration's pressures to those corporations over COVID speech, over the Hunter Biden laptop, and how the intelligence community put its thumb on the scale to get these media organizations to work in concert with them. I actually think, a reasonable point in that case is they were all on the same page anyway, so you wouldn't have even needed the government to apply pressure, although they still did, which is probably similar to Brendan Carr not needing to pressure ABC to suspend Jimmy Kimmel. I think actually they would have done that anyway. All this is to say, I'm right now trying to untangle the knot of what is cancel culture, what isn't cancel culture, what's hypocritical, what's not hypocritical. And one important element that is missing from the conversation is how much the people who are now on their high horses, and not unreasonably so in some cases, like Remesa Ozturk or Clay Higgins, people that are now on their high horse about this, not everybody, but some of the very powerful people who are now on their high horse about this have not extended the same coverage or concern over the last decade to a wide-scale suppression campaign that came from the left. And it's enormously frustrating, and it's not helpful. And that doesn't excuse, obviously, any unhelpful stuff coming from Pam Bondi, for example. But I'm on the right, and I'm not hearing anybody talk about it. And that's why I talk about things, by the way, when I disagree with the right. Remesa Ozturk, Clay Higgins, Pam Bondi, Columbia. I'll do the same thing. But right now, very powerful people are ignoring this huge chunk of the puzzle, and it is driving me insane. So thank you for sticking with me on this. I think social media incentives are part of the picture here. You don't have to post anything. You don't have to say anything. But when the dopamine reward is being dangled in front of you because the app is in your pocket, and when you open it up, it induces you to post with the promise of potential likes and retweets, and those likes and retweets themselves are driven by strong emotion, you're going to do much better on these algorithms with strong emotion in one direction or the other than you are with mild-mannered posts. We all know that. So this incentive system, I think, is driving us into further and further into a doom spiral. I think algorithms should go back to being timelines, and maybe that has to be done on a voluntary basis. Not unlike the Hays Code, perhaps. We'll see. But anyway, it's just really, really frustrating. And I'm sure some of you disagree with me. I appreciate you sticking it out if you got this far, because this is a really, really difficult thing to talk about without looking like you're a hypocrite or you're in bad faith. And it takes some space to air out the discussion. So thank you for tuning in. Again, undercurrents.tv is where you can go for the full premium experience of the show. Subscribe on YouTube, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and we'll be back here with more soon.